Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to Drawing Down the Stars. I'm Snappy, and I'm joined today by my really good friend, Graham Cwinn. How's it going, Graham?
I'm great. Thanks you for having me.
Amazing. So, we're here with Graham to talk today about their new poetry release, The Flesh is Not a Prison. So, Graham, you've been writing poetry for a while now. This isn't your first book, right?
No, this would be book number 5.
Oh, wow. Incredible. So, give us some background to this collection and tell us about what this collection really is about and what was the inspiration for putting this all together.
Right. So the majority of my writing, I've been writing since, well, for most of my life, but I've been publishing work since about 2013. And the main focus of my writing really is about mental illness, specifically my mental illness, which is schizoaffective disorder, which is like those who aren't familiar with it, it's like it's a schizophrenia spectrum disorder that only affects about 0.5% of the population. So it's quite rare, and it's kind of characterized by traditional symptoms of schizophrenia as well as mood episodes similar to bipolar. So it's kind of like a merging of schizophrenia and bipolar. And so I write about sort of my lifelong journey with this disorder. And this collection in particular, I wrote it all at the beginning of this year, and I was sort of seized by, I guess, a rare passion for life and myself. And I wanted to express that, and I never really expressed, like, I often have sort of glimmers of hope in my writing, but I've never really embraced myself, like, as in a loving sense in my writing.
Oh, wow.
And so with this overwhelming feeling of passion for existence, I wanted to create something that could maybe inspire other people to keep living as well.
Oh, man. I love that. That's so beautiful. Like, isn't that the ultimate goal, to inspire people to be to want to reinvigorate themselves in the life? Like, that's part of the reason why I really wanted to talk to you about this, because the title just really struck out to me. And then that art that you have, The Flesh is Not a Prison, because as someone who's deeply invested in spirituality myself, I've thought about that idea a lot, the flesh as a prison, especially coming out of Christianity and then having interest in Gnosticism. So I want to ask you specifically about that title. Like, what are your thoughts about this idea of the flesh and the prison, and what is life? Like, what are you getting at? That's such a deep, profound image to evoke right at the beginning of your book.
Thank you. So, really, for a long time, and I have a poem about this that I'll be reading today. I very much found myself trapped in myself, unable to express myself, unable to really connect with anyone or the world around me, or even connect with myself, really. And over the past year or two, I've kind of really changed that perspective, and I've shifted more to the thought that, it's actually liberating to be yourself, you
Yeah.
know? And sort of the joy of expressing who I am and sort of embracing that in spite of my difficulties, because we aren't really, it's easy to become defined by our hardships when really they're just one aspect of our lives. And feeling trapped inside myself, now I kind of realized that there's sort of like, there's a whole world in us. We're made out of 30 trillion or something cells. We really are just walking ecosystems, and that's kind of beautiful. It's like a miracle of life in itself.
No,
So I
that's
wanted to
such a good
explore that.
point. Like, just saying it in that sense, right? You get this image that you are not alone. You are not an individual. Your life is not just your own individual ego. You're responsible for what? Billions of microorganisms that make you up or that live off of you, right?
Yes, exactly. And another big emphasis, I guess, of the collection, of the book, especially near the end, is sort of an exploration of like post-humanism. And I sort of define that, I borrow a definition as being humans being physically, chemically, and biologically enmeshed and dependent on the environment. So quite often we have this anthropocentric, hyper individualist sort of perspective on existence, that man or humans sort of are like running the show and we own everything. And in a way, that's not only destroying the environment, but destroying like ourselves, because we are part of the environment. You know, and so it's about a return to a shift. We're seeing us as a piece of a larger, beautiful thing, as opposed to being this isolated, separate, dominating force.
Right, we're both an individual, but we also exist as part of an ecosystem, or a part
Like
of like a
within
super
beings.
organism, you know, like
Yes.
Gaia Earth, right? We're part of the natural world. We're not separate from. I love that. That's something that has always deeply resonated with me. Thinking about this idea, we'll get into this deeper when we get to your poem on post-humanism, but this is just something I've been thinking about a lot lately, especially now that we're on the cusp of things like AI, right? We're finally seeing the integration of AI into our daily lives. We're far away from intelligence in that human sense, but it's now becoming something that the average person is engaging with, right? And I
Yes.
keep thinking like we're having this sort of Saturnian moment where this is our child. It's both an extension of ourselves and something different. And it's both something that we're trying to enslave and control and something that may outpace us. What are your thoughts on AI and this whole post-human idea and how those
Mhm.
intersect?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I think that the technology can be useful in the sense that, like, if you look at, you know, with music, we have like plugins and preamps and stuff, and all these digital settings to sort of augment feelings that we're trying to express in the music. You know, but then you have people who are literally using programs to write music. I don't know if you've seen that before, but there's AI generated music.
Oh yeah.
And it's very bizarre, and it kind of scares me as an artist myself, you know, seeing this machine write poems and write novels and create
Part
music.
of me part of me is terrified for sure, but at the
But
same time I
it's
have this
intriguing. It's very
exactly.
intriguing.
I have this also this deep love and this passion because you know something that's really important to me is this idea of expanding perspectives, right, and incorporating as many new perspectives. And the first thing that strikes me about AI is that now you're giving millions more people brushes who could never paint, you know,
Absolutely. It's
right?
like the futurist movement in the early 1900s in Italy. It was like a theater art movement called Futurism, and it spread into Russia as well. And their belief was like, technology is not something we should be enslaving and controlling. It's something we should be integrating into ourselves to enrich our lives.
Right. No, I love
Um,
that. What I would love to see with AI is for people to celebrate AI. You know, if you create something with AI, tell us you created it with AI. And I don't think that should have any stigma or shame. It should be its own category of created artwork, right? Because you're working with different tools. I don't want us to, you know, like, I hate it when we get all this weird stuff. Like, I remember in university when I'm studying like art history and we're looking at a lot of the Renaissance or the early modernist greats, and people are like, were they using optical lenses? Were they using technology, or is this all done freehand? And I'm like, I wish they would just have been honest if they were. Like, it doesn't take away from the greatness of the painting. In fact,
no, definitely
you know,
not.
it adds something to it, you know, in my mind.
Definitely. I think as long as you're being honest and not passing it off as something that it isn't, then I don't
Right.
really see any qualms with it.
No, exactly. You know, it's just it brings up all these interesting things and interesting human fears, you know, because and that's another thing with this post-human idea, right? Because it means that we're no longer going to be human. And what does that mean? And, you know, I keep thinking like a lot of philosophers talk about this, and I've said this several times on the channel, like the most defining things that make up the human experience are this reaction to like to that we need that human connection, whether that's romantic or communal or sexual, right? And that's drives all people. And then the fear of death, right? So love and death are kind of like the things that are at this heart of this experience, right? But if we are able to all of a sudden control our sex drives down to, turning into something mechanical, and if we are able to no longer die, what do we strive for? Are we even human? How do we continue to evolve and progress? What are your
Absolutely.
thoughts?
It brings up a lot of big questions. The thought that, I have a poem in the book that I won't be reading tonight, but it does bring up the concept of fearing love.
Right.
And, kind of how like we fear loving ourselves because we conflate that with egotism. And we often fear each other because we see connection as like compassion, which is often perceived as weakness. Or in some cases, we see it as, branded as socialism, which is a good thing, but which a lot of people fear because they hear the word socialism and they think of authoritarianism, which are completely different things.
Right. Well,
Um,
I think there's also this inherent fear of stagnation, right? Like I think like as human beings who live in an environment of change, even those of us who are not aware are aware, on a biological level. And so when people hear things like absolute equality, which isn't what communism is talking about, but which is a lot of what people conflate it to being, it gets turned into that boogeyman of stagnation, which is a real thing to fear.
Absolutely. Stagnation. Yeah, that's often like something that weighs on me because I go through these heavy periods of not really creating anything. And then I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm not doing anything. What am I doing? But really, I am experiencing life and I'm absorbing information and kind of being like more of a sponge, right?
Oh, that's something
And
I so relate to.
absorbing new influences, and that in turn, it's a part of the creative process to not create and to simply exist and experience life, because art is life and life is art, right? They're
Yeah.
not really inseparable.
No, you're
um,
right, but it brings up like everyone right now went through a massive Saturnian moment where we were all isolated and locked down, right? And we
yes,
all had to sit with ourselves, and most of us to some degree did nothing or were less productive than we normally were, and had to confront it was a shadow work moment where I feel like we were meant to take a time out and reflect on ourselves, and I wonder if all of us did. But you know
I
it was
certainly
really
did.
hard to be in that moment. Like I appreciate it now that I'm coming out of it, but at the same time, man, was that difficult.
Absolutely.
And it brings back up to this idea of mental illness, and I think I want to ask you, because you said so much of your poetry is about your reaction to your mental illness. So like, how have you dealt with this, the whole changing of this situation in the last several years, between the lockdown and extremification, and then how do you deal with your normal in your unique expression of your mentality.
It definitely created a new set of challenges, the extreme isolation, because with everyone needs connection, but especially if you have some form of mental illness, that connection is very important to be attached to your support networks. And I think this was very isolating for people, not only being isolated from their friends, but like doctors, having phone interviews instead of meeting in person. Like it's pretty hard to talk to someone about their mental illness without seeing their body language.
Right. Well, I always think too, like, like, I mean, I'm on the spectrum. So personally, like it was very nerve wracking at first getting used to talking to people over the video, because I don't have the physical cues, and I didn't realize how much I was dependent upon them. And it nerved the hell out of me at first. And now I've adapted, but everyone
That's
has to
good.
adapt to like that, whether you're conscious or not, you know?
Oh, it's so true. New whole new set of challenges for everyone, I think. And it was actually during the pandemic that I was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder.
Oh,
So most of my life I was improperly diagnosed, and then in 2020, so the Royal in Ottawa, the Royal Mental Health facility, they opened up something called C Prompt, which was like an emergency, a COVID emergency response for people who were experiencing like isolation and depression and stuff. And so I was able to be diagnosed through C Prompt, and I met with a psychiatrist. He diagnosed me with schizoaffective disorder, answered all, I had all these questions in my life that weren't answered before, and then all of a sudden everything made sense.
okay. So what was
Um,
that? What was that like? Like, I get us don't you don't have to get super personal, but like, what was your day to day life like, and how did this explanation like change that, or affect that?
so the way that it really changed me was that it validated my experiences. Because not only do I have these intense depressive episodes for months, and then manic episodes that can last for weeks or months as well. And then I have these psychotic episodes that can overlap with those. Sometimes they're outside of my mood episodes. Like I'm always slightly psychotic, even though I'm on medications. Fortunately, very effective medications. But that's another thing. The diagnosis is able to get proper treatment, and that really improved my daily quality of life.
Right.
So, for example, just one personal anecdote. I talked about this in one of my books as well, one of my earlier books. My most during from 2018 to 2020 or 21, my most common hallucination was I would see people walking around my apartment. I live alone, so very distressing,
Right.
and quite unnerving and disturbing. And I was finally able to start a new medication, and that pretty much abolished that entirely. And then I did psychosis specific CBT as well. And kind of the biggest conclusion I came to, which I try to apply to other aspects of my illness, and which I think other people can apply as well, is that despite what I'm experiencing, regardless of how painful or disturbing it is, what's really going to harm me is how I react to it.
That's
Right.
beautiful.
So, yes, I'm seeing something, or I'm having these distressing thoughts, or I'm having distressing hallucinations. But if I sit with it and try to process it and sort of let it pass, it's very different than trying to push it away or harm myself or use drugs to escape. Um,
No,
it's like,
no, that's really
yeah,
beautiful. I just wanted to just putting this in a magical perspective. One of the things that I do a lot of, and I talk about a lot of, is dream work. And on the Discord that I run, several people have asked me about this because they have these horrific dreams where they're confronted with these dream entities. And I always tell people the same thing. You sit and you confront, and you just face it, because the more you deal with it and you recognize that as a dream, it's just an image in your mind, you know, and eventually you'll wake up, or eventually it'll change into something else. And there's such an
yes,
overlap between these two experiences.
absolutely. Psychosis is very much like being in a dream. And it does eventually pass, or like the intensity of it passes. And I'm sort of fortunate in that I can often recognize that what I'm experiencing isn't necessarily real. It took me a long time to come to that self-awareness, but not everyone does have that self-awareness who have psychotic illnesses. So I'm kind of fortunate in that regard, so that even when it's very distressing, I can use a lot of skills that I learned in CBT, like distress tolerance and mindfulness training, and deep breathing and stuff, and I can work through the intensity of the situation until it
So
passes.
what was it like when you first experienced these things, when you didn't have the CBT training and you didn't have the context of schizoaffective disorder? Like, I mean,
Terrifying.
I can't imagine like
In
seeing
one
someone walk
word,
in your room.
terrifying. Quite often, for most of my life, it was dismissed as overactive imagination or attention seeking.
Right.
And it wasn't until my late adulthood or adolescence that it became more acknowledged. I was diagnosed, I was misdiagnosed, but at least that was like the start of my journey to getting help. And then I was still having these horrible, distressing experiences. And I don't know, I was very frustrated. I think that my psychiatrist wasn't very good as well, based on experiences with other doctors since then. So I was, uh, getting frustrated with my situation. And once I got a different doctor and got diagnosed differently, the approach was much more empathetic.
Can you talk about that a bit? Because I know like this is every single person I've ever met with any kind of mental illness has gone through some, in Canada at least, which is the country we're both from, has had some kind of horrific, not necessarily horrific, but neglected, like non-effective treatment, or not taken seriously, or waiting sometimes years to get treatment. Can you talk about this? What was it like trying to get treatment for yourself, and are you getting treatment now?
I do talk about that in my new book, actually, in The Flesh is Not a Prison. I have a poem called The Cult of Psychiatry, and it's very much about how there is, like, despite the whole rapport of meeting with a psychologist or a psychiatrist, any mental health professional, is based off of personal experience, and the doctor has to take that personal experience, um, has to validate it first of all, I think, and second of all, has to, like if they're not validating or fully embracing what you're saying, they're not going to take you seriously, and you're not going to get the help that you need. And quite often, there's an attitude of, I'm the doctor, I know more than you do, even though it's about your own personal experience. So the sort of like jaded attitude quite often, especially with older psychiatrists, I find.
So like
Uh,
when you were going through this process, did people like doubt that you were having the hallucinations or the feelings of grandeur or the feelings of extreme depression that you
yeah,
you described? That seems so weird to me. I mean, in my limited experience talking to people, they tended to just listen and then validate. But you're saying that this was different with these kind of hallucinatory things.
yeah. So I eventually found a very good support network of friends who were understanding and willing to validate my experiences. Some
Mm.
of them I've known for a very long time. I did lose a pretty big, twice in my life, I lost a large portion of friends because of my illness and how I was behaving, and I think that that's valid. Um,
No,
because
that part's always so hard because it's out of your control, and you understand that you're behaving in a way that will push people away, but it's out of your control. You know, uh,
exactly, and it doesn't,
that's so painful to hear.
it never excuses the behavior, but it contextualizes why something like a situation like that would arise.
Right.
So a lot of frustration with doctors, with them not really taking you seriously, and then also it seems like they only know how to deal with a very specific subset of people, in the sense that, like, I have a pretty complex disorder, and I have three mental health, like, I have three specialists that I work with. And they all share notes and stuff, and they talk to each other, and it's like a whole, like, mental health support team. Because it's a very complex disorder. Whereas someone, not to downplay the severity of any other disorder, I think they all have a range of severity depending on each person's experience. But there isn't as much research, and even when there is research, it isn't necessarily taught in schools as much because it's less common. And
Right.
so there's sort of an outsider approach to the disorder, at least based on my experiences.
Also, how do you feel about like one thing that I've noticed within a lot of the medical Within a lot of medicine, it's just this propensity to want to cure, right? And I don't necessarily see a lot of these mental health issues as something that we should be thinking about curing. I think we should be thinking about putting these people in a place where they are in the best, living their best lives and are working to make their lives better at their own pace and what that means to
Yes.
them, and we need to pull back these ideas of what is healthy and what is not healthy and what is cured and uncured, because I feel like what happens is people with simple, no, I shouldn't say simple, nothing is simple, but with people with more easily approachable and solvable from an intervention standpoint, um, disorders get a lot more treatment, get a lot more attention. Whereas people with something that's like, there is no easy answer, and you probably are going to be on medication for your life. And a
Yep.
lot of doctors run when they hear about those patients. At least that's the perception from the outside.
Absolutely. And, a perfect example of this. So in addition to schizoaffective disorder, I struggle with chronic suicidality. So
Oh,
when I was 8 years old, I first thought about ending my life. And it's persisted almost daily since. I'm 34 now. So that's a large portion, the majority of my life, I've thought about ending it. And I was finally referred after 18 months of waiting to a specialist and they had a variety of treatment options, but each of these treatments is a research trial. And in these research trials, they're not studying schizoaffective depression. So I was barred from those treatments,
oh no.
even though they probably would be very helpful. Because they're not studying that, they're studying major depression and bipolar depression, which are both valid and need to be studied, but there needs to be a more readily available treatment that's more all-inclusive.
Of course, right?
And if I want any of these treatments, I have to pay out of pocket, which could range anywhere from $12,000 to $26,000, depending on the treatment.
That's just incredible to me, right? Like this blows my like absolutely blows my mind, because we have this myth, I call, in Canada, of universal health care, right?
It is
And
a
the
myth.
reality is, it's like, doesn't include your mental health. How can it include your total health, right? If it doesn't include your eyes and your teeth, how is this your total health, right? Like, it's insane to me.
Absolutely. It's very messed up, and I saw a saying once, and I spout it all the time. I don't know who said it. If it's inaccessible to the poor, it is neither revolutionary nor radical.
That's, yeah, wow. I'll look at that.
They're coming out with all these amazing new treatments for depression, but then it's either impossible to get the treatment or you have to pay for it. And most people don't have that type of money. I don't have that type of money. I live on a fixed income. I'm on disability. I live off of $1,000 a month or slightly
I
over
mean,
that.
and this is the reality of many people who are in your situation or similar, right? Like, these mental illnesses are debilitating. And even if you can work and produce an income for yourself, are you going to be able to do that all the time? Like, you, right? Like,
Exactly. And in addition to that, if you're on disability, if you work more than a certain amount, you get government clawbacks. They take part of your income off of your next disability payment.
I know.
It's very messed up, and it's designed to trap people. And there's a lot of problems with institutions, in my opinion. So that's sort of my journey, my struggle with this. I'm
No,
still
thank
trying
you
to
for
get
sharing.
treatment.
Thank you for sharing. And I mean, I just wanted to say one thing, that you're still, I remember over the last couple months chatting with you, you were waiting for months to get into CAMH, which is the major mental health
Yeah,
facility in Toronto, only for them to say, sorry, we can't help you. And now you're back at the drawing board, waiting again to get into someone else, right? Like,
absolutely.
so, out of all of the treatment that you've received over these last 4 or 5 years since you got diagnosed, like, how much of this time has been waiting?
The majority of it has been waiting. I mean, I've tried almost 17 different medications in my life.
Oh my gosh.
And with any of these medications, you have to gradually increase the dose, which can take months. Then you wait for several months to see if there's an effect. If there isn't, they increase the dose. You wait. If there isn't an effect, they increase the dose. And then they might say, it's not helpful. And then but you can't just stop it because it causes problems with your neurochemistry. So you have to wean back off of the medication and then try the next one. Increase it, increase it, increase it, feel it out, increase it, feel it out. Okay, it's not working. Taper off, taper off, taper off, taper off.
So this is
So
like
my
a
entire life
month-long
has been
process
waiting.
for each drug, basically, at
Yeah.
least. My gosh.
So my
And
whole
then
life
who
I've been
knows the
waiting.
physical effects?
Oh, so many physical effects. Some of them very bizarre, some of them very serious. Um,
Oh
and
my
not
god.
everyone experiences those side effects, but every body chemistry is different. I've been fortunate in that mostly I've just been non-responsive to medications. There have been a few that I couldn't tolerate the side effects of, like some extreme drowsiness, head fog, nausea, headaches. Those are just like the mild ones, but that often are caused by like most of these medications. They can have severe things like decrease in white blood cell count, or the onset of meningitis, or
Oh my gosh.
one medication that I was on. If you increase the dose too rapidly, you could get something called Steven Johnson syndrome, which is a blistering of your tissues, and it can kill you.
That sounds
Um,
horrific. Oh wow.
so fortunately, there's enough science to know like how gradually the dose should be increased. But again, you don't know how anyone's going to react to these. And I did a genetic test actually. It cost me $500 out of pocket, but it was a genetic test to determine which psychiatric medications would or wouldn't have side effects. And if
Right.
so, like what would the ideal dosage range be? And I think that this is a test that should be available to everyone. I don't think you should have to pay $500 to get this test. My
No, that
family
sounds
had to help me out with
absolutely
that. I didn't have
absurd.
$500.
Yeah.
But because of that, I determined that one of the medications I'm on too high of a dose, and so I lowered the dose, and I feel much better.
And this
Um,
can mean everything, right?
yeah, like I was getting tremors and like movement disorders and stuff. So
Jesus.
yeah, very bizarre.
That's wild to hear, Graham. So what I want to ask now is, now that we're kind of understanding the situation that you're in and the experience you've been going through, how does the art play in? How is the art healing and helping you in this journey of healing that you're going through?
Art has saved my life. I'll say that right now. Finding a voice for what I'm experiencing, whether it's writing or drawing or music, because I do all of those things. Finding a voice for myself, expressing what I'm feeling is very cathartic. And it's also like you get the sort of dopamine reward of completing something as well at the end of it, right?
Of
Because
course.
it's a process. And yeah, it's really about expressing what I'm feeling and giving a voice to that, and hoping that other people may see that and see traces of themselves in it. And maybe it will inspire them to either not feel so alone or to want to seek treatment themselves.
Right. No, that's so powerful. So I'm going to bring up your book again here. And
Sure.
just looking at the cover, like you did the art, correct?
Yes.
So this is something that immediately stood out to me because like it's hands that are decaying into birds and the birds are still hands, right? Like I thought that was
Kind of.
just
Yeah.
really profound and a powerful image. What does it mean to you?
So this drawing is watercolor pencils. So that's like pencil crayons that you can add water to afterwards to create textures and stuff. And then I did the hands and the birds in ink on top of that. It's based off of a hallucination I had in 2018. I actually transformed into a flock of birds.
Oh wow.
And I had this out of body surreal experience where I was flying around the city, and seeing things from this totally different perspective, and then I eventually amalgamated and returned back to my human form.
That
So
that's
it's
so
been,
wild to me.
it was a very surreal, psychotic experience, and but it wasn't terrifying. It was liberating for me. I felt like
Okay.
I was free.
So this I relate to in a very, very, very deep, profound way, because one of the most important experiences for me, and part of the reason why I'm here, was a heroic journey I took with psilocybin mushrooms. And on that heroic journey, I found myself being ripped apart down to the atom and becoming synonymous with all of matter. And then, like a wave, being reformed into a single point. And I
Wow.
experienced this over and over and over and over and over again for like 8 hours because I took way too much. But it literally changed my entire perspective. Like, so what did this experience do for you?
It reminded me that I'm a collective and not just a single being, which sort of makes me want to care for my body more, knowing that it's like composed of like trillions of living things.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's hard to take care of myself, but I want to take care of myself.
Right.
And it also, I guess, again, that feeling of liberation, that like my experiences, my psychosis, yes, it's a detriment. It can be detrimental to my life, but it's also a different lens that I'm seeing things through. And so, like, quite often when the world looks like I'm inside of a painting, like looks like an oil painting or something, or like colors are vibrant, like a digital sort of landscape.
That's really
Um,
profound. I've heard a lot of people with schizoaffective disorders describe life like this, and see these ultra vibrant colors. And you see that reflected in a lot of art by people with these kinds of disorders.
Absolutely. You see sort of a juxtaposition of bright, vibrant colors or very dark, muted colors. Because
Right.
part of schizophrenia and schizoaffective is negative symptoms. That's what they're described as. So, alogia, which is decreased thought and speech productivity, avolition, decreased goal directed behavior, anhedonia, the loss of ability to experience pleasure, flat affect, so little to no change in tone or body language despite a change in emotions.
Oh,
And these symptoms are often quite more long lasting and debilitating than positive symptoms, which are hallucinations and delusions. Because the hallucinations and delusions can sort of be like, yeah, they're terrifying, but they're more manageable with medications. And they also, if they're not to an extreme where it's like so debilitating and disturbing, then like I find them quite beautiful. And
right.
it's sort of like a way of like seeing, it's like I get to see this different part of reality that other people don't get to experience necessarily.
That's beautiful. It's incredible that you're able to find such positive expression in something that so many find so debilitating. It really reminds me a lot of like the Eastern approach, because when I was in India, you'd see a lot of people who have mental illness, and they're treated like religious figures. And they're encouraged to explore. And some, don't get me wrong, that's not all. It's not all good, but there is something about that. One of the things that they noticed when they were doing these studies of people in India and in China, people with schizophrenic affective disorders of the various types tend to not have malevolent hallucinations. They don't see demons, they see angels or fairies. And I think partially that's just the culture.
Yeah, definitely. Like that is a good point. That psychosis is not always terrifying.
Mm.
And I need to like, sometimes it's actually quite alluring and you want to be lost in that world as opposed to running away from it. For example, like I get thought insertion where like thoughts are put into my head from somewhere else. and they're quite often dark and disturbing, but sometimes they're very like life affirming and almost like grandeur inflating, you know? And it's like you have to keep that in check, but at the same time, it's kind of nice hearing this voice from somewhere else being like, "You're better than that,"
Right?
you know?
I can imagine. You know, and we don't ever hear those stories. We only hear about when the voice starts telling you that you're God, you know, or you
Exactly.
need to
Like
collect every spoon on earth or something.
I don't know
You
if
know?
it still exists, but for a while in the States, there was something called the People Who Hear Voices group. And it's about people who say that they hear voices, but they're not disturbed by the voices. They actually find comfort in them. And like they've actually like given them positive messages.
Right. And I often wonder if a lot of the people who were shamans of our ancient periods were people who had, you know, some form of psychosis, you know.
Very
It's
possible.
it's hard to say, right? You know, it's an interesting thing to ponder, right? Like I do think that we're losing out when we take people who are suffering from mental illness and treat them as completely disabled, right? Like all one thing I think that's important to highlight about the human experience is that sometimes the things that hold us back, these things that are limiting, are defining at the same time. And these are challenges to overcome that cause us to create things of like real power and beauty, you know?
Absolutely.
Like there's a reason why some of the best artists have these mental illnesses, like your Van Goghs or your Artaud's, you know, or why some of our greatest scientists are physically disabled, you know, like our Stephen Hawking's, you know, or artistic, like we don't know for sure because it wasn't around then, but if you read Newton, he's on the spectrum. Let's be honest, you know,
Yeah.
right? And it's like if we had a better approach to of being inclusive of all these perspectives, even if they're challenging or these perspectives are even hurtful to the individual, maybe they could benefit us and society and the individual as a whole, you know?
Definitely. It's a matter of validating the experience and encouraging communication about those experiences as opposed to stifling them or giving like sympathy, because it's more about empathy than sympathy. I think is what's important, is putting yourself into their situation and being like, okay, what does life look like to this person, and
Right.
how can I accommodate that?
You know, and I was thinking about like after our talk with Artaud, I kept thinking about there's a certain kind of outlook that would look at someone like Artaud and say, this is a man who never worked a day in his life, never produced really anything in that capitalist kind of mindset. But at the same time, this is someone who produced an incredible body of artistic work that has been celebrated well after his death. You know, so it's like, and you see all these kind of artists, they're not productive by our 9 to 5 sense of work, but then they are by our, you know, in every other metric. Like, what's going on here, right?
Capitalism is definitely a fiend.
Yeah.
um I don't I broached that topic a little bit in my new book. And I don't
Well,
fully explore it, but
I just keep thinking, like a while ago, several years ago now, I watched the documentary. I think it's still on Netflix. It's called The Devil and Daniel Johnson. He's like a really famous outsider musician. And he had severe bipolar disorder. And by the end of his, like near the end of his life, what happens is they get him on medication. He becomes very productive again, but at the same time, he becomes very obese, and he become, you know, and it's like there's all these
metabolic
other issues that
symptoms are
come
a big
about,
problem with these medications.
you know, and it's like it's one of these things where it's like I heard some people in the documentary like he's so much more productive now, and he's so much more like living a regular life now. But then they're interviewing him, and he doesn't have the same kind of profound depth that he did when you know, like it's clear that the medication is helping, but it's hindering. And I wonder if like maybe if we changed like what we expect of these people, he could have lived something better. I don't know, right? It's not for me to judge. It's up to the doctors. It's so hard with these mental illnesses.
It
But
is.
it's just weird to hear people frame it in a term of at least they're productive now. You know, like that bugs me.
Exactly. It's
You
very
know,
frustrating because it's like we should just be here to live, man. Like, why do we have to?
Yeah.
If the world was more embracing of different lifestyles and integrating them into society, maybe we would be better off.
Right? Wouldn't we? I'd like to think we'd be better off, you know. So with that, let's get into your actual poems here.
Sure,
So
yeah.
let's look here at the first poem, A Sense of Purpose. Do you want to like set up the poem at all before you read it, or
For this one, I'd like to read it first and then kind of talk about it because it's a bit self-explanatory.
all right, go right ahead.
So this is A Sense of Purpose. A culmination of our life experiences has distorted us, forced us into hideous contortions that separate us from ourselves and the world. We learn to live in a false reality where the only thing we know is pain. But there is more to life. I want to create something that will shatter that reality and bring us back to this one. I want to help us return to ourselves.
Wow.
And so I was leaning very heavily on Artaud when I wrote this poem. The theater of cruelty, especially, was dancing in my head when I wrote this poem.
I
Because
definitely get that element of like the breaking of the body, you know, of breaking it apart, the shattering and coming back as a whole. Like, wow.
absolutely, I think that, just again, all of our life experiences have create like no matter what life we live, we end up putting these lenses or these mental lenses on, and it sort of changes how we see ourselves and how we see the world, quite often for the worse.
Right. I
And
want
so,
to actually just in that because there's a line here that immediately stood out to me when I read it the first time that directly relates to that, which is we learn to live in a false reality where the only thing we know is pain. And this really hit hard to me as someone who studies a lot of Eastern philosophy because, like, if everyone knows that the first noble truth of Buddhism is life is suffering. And this is one of the
absolutely,
first things that you're confronted with when you're dealing with any kind of Eastern perspective is this reality of suffering. And I'm not dismissing that, right? Suffering is a part of reality, but it is
it is.
one side of a mirror, you know, one side,
It's one facet of existence, and it can control and enslave us.
right? Right? And like I always think, you know, when you look at a lot of the like there's certain types of these monastics who deny reality and sit and they do everything to not deal with the suffering. They refuse to face, they refuse to adapt, they refuse to change, they go into themselves, they kill the ego, and they literally just try to extinguish the light. Like that's what nirvana means, right? If you break it down etymologically, to blow out, to extinguish. And this just
Right.
like that whole thing has always just terrified me. You know, it just seems so anti everything. And like in my like I look at the natural world and like I do recognize that everything is going to eventually decay, but out of decay comes what? Out of the shit comes the flower, right?
Right. I have a poem, not from this collection, from my next book that's coming out. Even within rot, there was life. We look at mold, the bugs that feed off of the decaying matter, the fungus. These things couldn't thrive without death.
Right. That's amazing. And then another line that I really liked here is I want to create something that will shatter that reality and bring us back to this one. You know, like you're creating to destroy, right? It's that juxtaposition of that imagery which is so important to the real natural world because with every creation there is a destruction. There's always a tit for tat. And in the birth of the new, we shatter the old, right?
Absolutely. As Artaud would say, life is always someone else's death.
Wow.
Um,
That's really beautiful.
and so, yeah, sometimes the death of ourselves. We live many lives throughout our one lifetime. And some of us live in different phases for longer than others. And quite a lot of us, I think, are hurting right now, especially now. And I want people to sort of recognize that that pain can remind us that we're alive. You know, it's like it's a signal that your brain is sending you, being like, hey, wake up, you know?
Yeah.
It's a wake up
No,
call
yeah.
that maybe something needs to be done about this pain. It'll never go away, but we can learn to grow around it.
I love that. Like that's what immediately attracted me to your art was that it's life affirming, you know? I see it in the same vein as like Artaud and of like the great Greek tragedians, you know? It's of the same quality, you know?
Thank you. I appreciate
I
that.
love it.
Arto is my biggest influence, as we know. So
I mean, it stands out there, right? And you know, just to end on this poem, right? I want to help us return to ourselves, right? It's about
right.
like that stood out to me because so you recreate yourself in your own image. It's a death of the old, but you get to define what that rebirth is. You know, you get to recreate yourself. And this is something like so many of us are afraid to do, and we're taught not to do it as children, and then we don't do it as adults, and then we pass away. And it's like you could be in this
Absolutely.
constant stage of recreation in beauty if you want to. You can make your life art.
I like to, yes, absolutely. I like to think of ourselves as sort of like we're each a ship of Theseus, where we're slowly replacing parts of ourselves that are becoming maybe not serving us anymore. And by the end of it, you're not really sure which pieces are new and which are old.
And it doesn't matter,
It doesn't
right?
matter. It's you.
Right, and that's the thing. What matters is the image of the ship, right, that you hold in your mind, that you create that image, right? And that's the thing, you can change the blueprints too. You don't have to have that old ship. You know, that ship can evolve. I love it. So let's go to your next poem here.
Yeah, so my next two poems are sort of related. I'll read them one and then the next one. Well, we can talk about it before we go to the second one.
Sure.
But they both follow my theme of struggling with my chronic suicidality. Um, so I have attempted suicide 5 times in my life. Since and I still think about it. And so these poems are an exploration of why that wouldn't be a good idea, if that makes sense. So sort of
No, yeah.
denying those thoughts, or like, they'll take it
Overcoming.
from, yeah. So I'll just read the poem. Untying the noose. Not a day goes by where I don't think about killing myself. My mind replays images of my body hanging from the bridge near my house. Then I think about who would find me. They would be scarred forever. And what about the people I leave behind, devastated beyond repair? What if I fail? What then? I will live with the shame of yet another failed suicide attempt. Attempt number 6. I can't do that to them. I can't do that to myself. I am in terrible pain. I am alive.
Wow.
So yeah, this is just about challenging a mental image that often comes into my head.
Yeah.
And the next one is the war against suicide. I have realized that these thoughts of suicide are not representative of how I feel about my life. They simply exist. And I must combat them with fire and steel, words and worship, creation and integration. All the tools and weapons at my disposal shall be used in this war against the urge to kill myself.
That's so powerful, you
I
know?
posted that one recently, and a lot of people, it resonated with a lot of people. So these two poems are linked. They're not together in the collection, but I thought they would fit well together here.
Right.
Um, it's a matter of recognizing that my illness is not me. It's an aspect of me that creates images and illusions that can be confused for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, no,
Um,
it totally makes sense.
and
I really, I keep going back to our talk about Artaud in the Bacchic theater because it's clear like how much that influenced you. And I just keep thinking of this, the whole entire essence of tragedy, right, is to reaffirm life. That's the whole point of it. You deal with your shit. You go to war against suicide. You go to war against these feelings of depression. You rebirth yourself, you know?
Absolutely. And the war might never end, but if you don't, it only ends if you stop fighting, right?
Right.
That's when the end comes. And so it's a matter, these poems are about recognizing that my suicidality is an image or an illusion. And if I did, and these poems are a way of distancing myself from those thoughts so that I can combat them more naturally by separating them from me.
That's so profound and powerful, right? And it just shows us this incredible ability of art, you know, by creating art, by expressing these feelings that you have, you're able to distance yourself and confront them through this cathartic release, right?
Absolutely. It's like in demonology, by knowing the true name of a demon, you can gain power over it, right? Or it
Right.
loses some of its power.
And like recently I was talking with Ammon and Dion, and we were looking into theater, sacred theater. And what we recognized, or what Ammon was showing us, was that the sacred theater was actually connected to the cult of Asclepius. And Asclepius is the god of healing. Okay. And Asclepius's healing methods, they talk about it. His number one healing method was he would get you to write a song or write a poem about your feelings. And then he would get you to go to sleep and dream about them and then tell him about the dreams. How
I love
amazing is
that.
that?
I
Right?
love that. I think that everyone should write, even if it's just for themselves.
Right?
Whether it be journaling or poetry or something, some form of self-reflection or expression, I think is integral to life.
Yeah.
And whether, maybe you don't want to write, maybe you just want to doodle or just write down some thoughts from your head that day, anything I think can be creation in its own right.
This is a really important part because I wanted to ask you about this because so many of us are afraid to confront the darkest aspects of ourselves, are afraid to take something like suicide and put it on paper. You have done that. You've taken the ugliness that is you and you've made it public. What does that mean for you? And how does that help you?
It Well, there's two steps to that. For the creation aspect is catharsis, creating a voice for my feelings. The second part is showing that to other people because I'm hoping that they can, anyone who also struggles with this will realize they aren't alone and realize that it's not the end and that it isn't them. It
Right.
is one aspect of them that they can hopefully challenge and learn to live with, or destroy altogether if they're able to.
You know, and I really want to highlight, like, people always underestimate the power of art, you know, and you said it yourself in this interview that Artaud saved you. And in our conversations, you've talked about how people have admitted to you that you have saved them through your art. So it's real, right? And you've experienced this in both aspects.
Absolutely, I've seen both sides of the coin, and I'd like to, like, last year I released a poetry compilation, and it was myself and 9 other writers. I published it through my small press. I only made 45 copies, and the theme was mental illness. So I had each writer talk. They express something that they feel, related to mental health in some way, and it sold out very quickly. And my goal is to donate all of the proceeds to a mental health organization, because I raised about $300 from the book sales.
That's
So
amazing.
I'm just trying to decide where exactly I want to give the money to, because there's so many organizations, lots of people that need help right now. It's very difficult to narrow it down. So I've been doing a lot of research into different organizations, and trying to decide where I'd like to put that money towards. But this is something I'd like to do again in the future, I think, just because I was surprised by the response. I think that a lot more people are suffering than we like to let on.
Right. And it is something like, I mean, our culture is getting better, but it is something that traditionally we don't talk about and that we shame people
No.
for, you
Very
know?
stigmatized.
Right? Well, we have this culture, at least within the Christian tradition, right? We regard these things as personal faults, as sin, often, or
Yes.
as expression of sinful behavior. And so these are things to be repented and to be subdued and to be fought against and to be put in the dark corners. You can't face them and talk about them as what they really are, because that would destroy the myth of sin, right?
Exactly.
Ugh, it's so frustrating. But let's keep going here with your poems.
Sure, sure. So my next poem is called Liberation. I'll read it first. Um, for decades, I felt I was trapped inside myself. I realize now there was a whole world in me, and that it resonates with the world around me. I am free to wander the caverns of my skull, to swim in my veins, to dance inside my limbs. And I realize that the more I dance, the more others want to dance with me.
So this poem, when I first read it, really just stood out to me and resonated with me. And I don't know if you were intending for this, but I immediately got the image of Shiva Nataraj, right? The dancing Shiva of creation, which is Shiva is the god of destruction and creation. And when he's doing that Nataraj dance, it's the unfolding of the cycle of infinity. He's both giving birth and destroying everything through this celebration of life in music, you know?
Beautiful.
And it's seen as like the ultimate liberation. By engaging in the dance of Shiva, you identify with Shiva, and that's how you free your soul, is through participation in the affirmation of life. At least that's how I see it.
I love that. That's
and
fantastic.
and I see the same thing, like when I'm reading this thing, and I realize that the more I dance, the more others want to dance with me. Like, that's beautiful. Oops, sorry, I accidentally
No
skipped ahead.
worries. Yeah, because I wrote that line because I found that the more I talked about my experiences and, both positive and negative, it really attracted a tribe, I like to call it, of supporters, of friends, and we all support each other. And it's very much like a community sort of that I formed with like a lot of my friend groups. And when you're speaking about the beauty of life and the pain of life, it attracts it, like it turns people's heads. They say, "Hey,
Mhm.
wait a minute, what's this person talking about?" And then maybe they'll see a reflection of themselves in it, and they'll want to engage in that as well.
That's beautiful. I also, when I'm reading this poem, it immediately connects to the overarching theme, to the title, right? The flesh is not a prison, because
Exactly.
the Gnostic pursuit of liberation, right? Which is that escape from the prison, which they identify with the body and with the natural world. And then you're saying here that you're trapped inside yourself. So, what is this liberation for you? Because it's clearly not a liberation from the self.
It's a liberation of the self.
Wow.
It's a recognition that what I'm experiencing is not chains that bind me. It's there's a way to unshackle yourself and live unrestrained,
In acceptance, I guess, right?
and through acceptance. Exactly.
So that real liberation comes through this process of being yourself, accepting yourself, and entering into that flow, right? That transformative flow of adaptation. Am I getting that right?
100%.
That is right there. That's the mystery, people. Right, Graham, you're a Bacchic mystic. I love it.
I didn't even know it.
Oh wow, yeah, I love that poem. Is there anything else you want to say about this one?
I think that's about it.
Okay, let's check out your next one here. This
Sure.
one is going to generate a lot of talk, I think.
Yeah. So this one is titled Posthuman. And so just to reiterate, posthumanism as I see it is the humans are physically, chemically, and biologically enmeshed and dependent on the environment. So I'll read the poem. We must cease imagining ourselves as apex beings worthy of owning the planet. This is destroying us all. Instead, we must conceive of humans as pieces of a vast network where each living and non living thing is worshipped together. Humility and respect. This is what the earth is asking of us.
That's so beautiful. I mean, I want to. I'm kind of a big sci-fi nerd, so immediately go to sci-fi. Are you familiar with Frank Herbert and Isaac Asimov?
I am. I haven't read a lot of their works, but I've studied science fiction in one of my classes in university, actually, in a
Awesome.
playwriting
Okay,
in a
so
playwriting course.
we can go off on this. This will be fun. So because largely Frank Herbert is reacting to Isaac Asimov, who came first. And Isaac Asimov, if you read the entirety of his Foundation series, at the very end, his his whole envision for humanity is he has his robot, his central robot, this Danny Law character, help usher in humanity's evolution to the point where we become Galaxia, okay, which is a massive super organism that encompasses the entirety of the Milky Way, where
Wow.
all living beings live together as this super organism, but also individuals. So we can participate in a shared one consciousness or go about our own individual experience. And this is sort of like the ultimate profound thing. So Frank Herbert sees this and he recoils in absolute disgust and fear. Okay. Like I see that and I'm like, as a young person, I'm like, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever read in my life.
Yeah,
You know, like
absolutely.
where's Galaxia? Where can I dive in? Frank Herbert, no, he's absolutely terrified because in his mind, this would lead to that absolute stagnation that he was talking about, you know?
Right.
And he goes, what about other universal beings then? If there's Galaxia, then there could be, what about other universes? What if some other being comes and crushes you? You know, and what do you think about this? There's this constant play between this desire to come together and want to be whole and to want to exist in this loving peace, and then also this desire to separate and be individual and to rebel and to fight. And these two things are so intrinsic to us as human beings, and they're both in either extreme are can become evil, right? I mean, as close to evil as we can literally
Yeah.
have, right? You know, so like what are your thoughts on all that?
I think the two concepts can coexist. I think it's possible to be part of a collective while still retaining your individuality. I think the community is important. I think that we've evolved to be a part of a community,
Right. What do you
really,
think
like
though
with
is like the
group
point of
selection.
what do you think is the point of struggle? And how do we like what I see with something like Asimov is Asimov develops a society that fundamentally removes struggle, right? And this is what caused Isaac or what caused Herbert to shudder. Not that it wasn't a beautiful idea, but that it removed that struggle. And without that struggle, there would be no evolution, and eventually that system would decay. And he was basing this upon his observations of the natural world, right? Any system which becomes a closed system like this eventually crumbles. You know, it stops reproducing. It stops. You need to have that kind of struggle. So it's like, what I wonder is, how do we, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot about this post human stuff is how do we overcome death? How do we overcome our limitations? How do we connect with the universal but maintain this struggle? How do we, like what it's such a conundrum.
It's a big question. I think that it is possible to have, like friendly competition still. Like, you can, like within a group, we can have other people creating and striving for things, and those could be similar or different. And it's a matter of celebrating that and encouraging the individuals within the collective to continue, I guess,
Yeah.
existing. And
One thing I kept
from
thinking,
that we'll have natural dynamics, I think, that
right.
will keep the system from evolve, that will help it continue evolve.
One thing I keep thinking about is when I look at the mystery, what I see often with the mystery is it's like an evolution of, first you have like these ecstatic rituals that are largely based around sacrifice, and sex, which is all about that. Um, you have to expend your excess wealth. You have all of this excess stuff. You got to destroy it, and it's a very human need to expend. Right? True art is wasteful. Let's be real. Right? In that purely naturalistic material sense, right? It's
Yes.
philosophically beyond meaningful, but it comes out of waste. And there's something very deeply profound about this human need to destroy. What you see with the mystery is almost like we need to face death. We need to deal with this sacrifice. We need to transform it again. And the sacrifice now becomes incorporated within this ritual. So instead of a literal death, you go through a death and resurrection via the drug, you know? Instead of having instead of seeing someone be ripped apart and be reborn, you go through it and are ripped apart in your mind, and you're able to be reborn. So a friend of mine, Rob, brought this up when we were talking the other night, and he was like, "What if in the future we had simulation video games that just simulated life and death and like introduced trauma that way in a safe way? So we don't get rid of trauma, but rather we use it as a way to change, to force us to adapt."
That's a really interesting point.
Sorry, just stuff I've been thinking about.
No,
And
I
your
love
poem
it.
just made me go there. I just thought it was so interesting. Like posthumanism is just such an interesting thing because I feel like where we stand, right? It's so hard for us to imagine what that would be like to be like as you described, to be connected, to no longer be in this ego, right? It's a really powerful image.
It's a powerful image. It's something that scares a lot of people. They think that a lot of people think that a collective means a restriction of personal freedom, and I don't necessarily think that's inherently true.
That's a really good point. Oh man, that's something you see a lot within leftism. Like I really enjoy a lot of anarchist thought, and a lot of people are really shocked to find that there is anarchism, communist anarchism, that promotes a kind of divine selfishness and sees greed and selfishness as inherent and meant to be adapted within these socialist systems. I don't necessarily 100% agree, but these ideas are out there.
Absolutely. There's a lot of really interesting, thought provoking stuff out there that I don't necessarily agree with, but it makes you go, I wonder.
Right, and it's always good, like I keep saying, we have to include all of these perspectives, because until you challenge yourself and you really think about it, you don't know. Right.
Absolutely.
Let's continue because I think
Sure.
this last
We'll go to the last poem here.
I think this last one is my absolute favorite of the book, so I'm really excited for you to read it.
It's one of my favorites too. This is a return to sorcery. This is a demand that we as a society return to the mystical aspect of being. By mystical, I mean the recognition that there is a grand energy in all things, and the wonder and reverence instilled by this recognition. Too many of us feel aimless and lost. Whether one is religious or not, it is essential to feel like one is a part of something greater than ourselves. We did not evolve to be solitary creatures. We crave connection and acceptance. What better way to discover that than by opening up to the universe? We must once again ritualize the aspects of existence that connect us to ourselves and everything that surrounds us.
Like, wow. I just like this is why we're friends, okay? Because like this kind of sums up everything that I've been wanting to do with this channel. Everything that I've been kind of pushing towards with my own personal kind of philosophical, mystical approach to things, just this understanding of recognizing the wonder and having this reverence for nature and the natural world and this reverence for multiplicity to celebrate our individuality in its absolute individuation. All perspectives are valid. Every experience is worth celebrating. No matter no matter what our perception tells us on the surface, there's something valuable there, right?
Absolutely. Definitely.
Man, like, and I want to ask you, okay, so going over this poem here, and I'm looking at it. What do you mean by sorcery? Like, what is like define sorcery for us?
For me, anyways, sorcery is, well, I kind of sum it up in the last stanza of the poem. It's sorcery is a ritualization of something that connects you either to yourself or to something greater or something around you. So it could
Right.
be literal rituals, or it could be writing out a gratitude list every day. At the end of the day, you sit down and you write for everything you're grateful for that day. Or just take time to meditate and contemplate existence, think about yourself, think about your place in the world. I think there's lots of ways that we can become sorcerers, and it's about connection. At the end of the day, we're the universe is one, and we are one with the universe. And we might be individuals, but it's kind of like our bodies, millions,
Right.
trillions of cells that are individual organisms operating in unison as this one beautiful being, right? That's
That's deep.
humanity. That's
That is. That
that's
is.
that's not just humanity, that's all of life. Even look
Right.
at rocks and like empty space. Like part of matter is just empty space. And without space, we'd have no definition or separate or like of what different things are. We'd all just be one giant blob.
100. This is something I love, right? Like, oh man, it makes me think of monism, which is at the center of a lot of this philosophy. My personal philosophy, I come back to monism, but it's this understanding that even monism exists within a cycle, right? It explains the cycle of nature, right? The one becomes many so it can know itself. And this is the key, right? You can't have knowledge as one, like you just said, right? If there's, imagine that all that exists was my hat. All you can say is the hats, like language is based upon difference. You have to have the other. You have to experience the other and appreciate the other as greater than yourself, right? Like, I feel like this is so much what our life experience is about, right? Learning to recognize ourselves in the other and heal that wound. And through that healing, we come together and we go through the same process again and again, right? It's this like, I think experience itself, right? Like, suffering, yes, right? Like life is hard. What you're going through with your mental illness is hard. No one is denying that. But at the end of the day, life itself is beautiful and is profound in spite of that hardness. And in fact, that hardness almost makes it more beautiful, If that's a lot of people don't like it when I say that, but that's how I feel.
Yeah, as Artaud would say, I always go back to Artaud because I'm obsessed with him. Uh, at the bottom of things is pain, but to be in pain is not to suffer, but to survive.
Right.
It's like it can remind us that we're alive. A lot of people are dead without realizing it.
Yeah.
Or
And
think, they're wandering
yeah.
around in this weird stasis world with their mental blinders on and not really opening themselves up to even themselves, really.
Right. And just to go back to this idea of sorcery, when I think about magic and I think about sorcery, really what magic and sorcery fundamentally is, in my conception, is communication. It's that
Yes.
communicating with something outside of yourself and sharing information, sharing your perspective with the other. That's where the real magic is. How do you convey to something that can't be conveyed? How do you share yourself? Like, it's so beautiful that like we can have this conversation. I can never understand your perspective, but at the same time, through this conversation, through this art, I can glimpse what you've gone through. And through that experience, I can better myself. You know, like that's beyond beautiful to me.
It's powerful. I think any form of art is very staggeringly powerful in that way. You know, because you don't have to know everything about, you can never really know everything about somebody else, but you can see, like you said, like scraps or pieces of them, and you can find familiarity in that, or even just even not familiarity, maybe it'll just help expand your understanding of
Right.
what other people might be going through.
Right.
And I think that's so important. Like empathy is at the center of everything.
Right? And like, I really love this line where you go, whether one is religious or not, it is essential to feel like one is a part of something greater than ourselves. We did not evolve to be solitary creatures, right? And this is something that so few of us, or we don't want to, many of us don't want to face. We can't function by ourselves. I don't care how much of a rugged man or rugged woman or whatever you are. You can't live alone. Eventually it'll affect you and you'll go crazy, you know?
Even if you live completely isolated in the wilderness, you're relying on the wilderness to survive. You're
Wow.
interacting with it,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um,
That's so true. You need that natural world, right? And think about it like you take a baby without its mother, without its parent, that baby can't live. You know, it needs human touch. It needs physical affection. And this is something I always try to talk about when we talk about like a lot of people I feel get really confused about sex. You know, they think that the fundamental thing of sex is procreation. And don't get me wrong, that's hugely important. And I'm not downplaying procreation, but the fundamental thing to me about sex is connection. It's about
yes,
establishing a loving relationship with someone else. That's what sex does, right? Like, otherwise, we'd be like other animals and we'd go into heat during the spring and then never go and fuck again, you know? But meanwhile,
it's so
people are
true.
having sex 24/7, right? At least those of us who aren't asexual, right? You know?
Yeah, it is. It is about connection, and you know, until I realized that I had a very confused relationship with sex, to be honest, until I was like, oh, right, this is a way of bonding and like merging with someone temporarily, you know? It's kind of like a mini neural link.
Right? You know, and it's about, yeah, connecting with someone else and having yourself fulfilled through another, you know?
There's a
Right?
lot of
And then,
vulnerability in that.
oh man, there's so much vulnerability, right? Like, and a lot of people, you know, like I feel like we don't connect and we don't talk enough about sex, you know, as a spiritual and as a transformative action, as an act of healing. You know, we always talk about it as an act of individual pleasure fulfillment, and like
Exactly.
that's not what it should be. You know,
No.
it's meant to fulfill you and your partner, right? You're supposed to become better for it, to heal, right?
Exactly. In Judaism, it's actually like there's the concept that like if you're with your partner, you're supposed to put your partner's pleasure before your own.
Right. And like just thinking about this and expanding it, there's another great line in your poem here, right? We crave connection and acceptance. What better way to discover that than by opening up to the universe, right? And this really relates to paganism and to magical practice and to a lot of the Greek stuff we talk about, because the experience of the divine is an erotic experience. It is a sexual experience. It's not just that, but it is that fundamentally. To know something is to love it, you know? And this there is no difference between these two, right?
Absolutely. Love is understanding.
Right? It's so amazing. Like, yeah, and like I feel like you know, like this is what it's saying. Like your poem really highlights this idea that we're all, so many of us are lost, right? We're not connecting to the world. We're not, and the reason for that, I think, is this inability to communicate, or this trouble communication with communication. And when I think about sorcery and magic, it's establishing those communication links. It's reinvigorating that. It's creating an image. And what I mean by an image, it's something that's imagined. It includes all the senses, not just the voice, not just art, but these profound human experiences that we try to share with each other, right?
Yes, definitely.
Wow, Grant, this has been so much fun. Just going over your poems. Thank you so much for taking this time with me. So, what I
Thank
want to ask is, like, what do you want to end on? Like, if you were to sum up your work in this book and what you want people to take away from it, like, what would you say?
you.
I have to ask the hard questions, right?
Yeah, I want people to read this book in particular and not feel alone. I want them to feel like it is possible to connect with something and to love yourself. And there's no shame in loving yourself.
Beautiful, right? That's amazing. And if I want, and if there's one thing I want people to take away from this interview that we're doing here, it's that sharing these troubling experiences is profound and healing, not just for you, because so many of us, I remember, like, I've often thought that, oh, if I'm writing down and I'm sharing my pain, that it's just selfish. I'm just attention seeking. But really, we all need that. It's cathartic release, it's purgation, and guaranteed there's someone out there who needs your words, who is going through something similar, right?
Absolutely. I felt that way when I was reading Artaud. It was like, wow, he's putting a lot of words to feelings and thoughts that I have that I didn't know how to describe before.
Right.
And many other people have said that to me, that
Exactly.
my work has provided a voice,
It has,
And
because look, we're having this conversation right now, right? If it wasn't for this art that you created, none of us would be here. Having this in dealing with these deep, profound human experiences, right? Your willingness to share your pain facilitated that, and this is just the beginning, like the smallest part of what has happened, right? You told me you literally saved people's lives. You know, like,
yeah,
that's
it's
so
astounding.
amazing.
It's
And
profound.
anyone can do that. We all can do that through this communication, right?
We all have the power to save someone.
I love it, right? So please, everyone, go down to the link below. Make sure you click on the link tree, and you can be provided all the different ways that you can go and get Graham's new book. The Flesh is Not a Prison, right? And you can buy it from your press. You were saying it's also available on all of the major presses like Barnes and Nobles and Amazon, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So if you go to the link tree, the first link will be my small press. That might be a better option for people living in Canada. And then there's Barnes and Noble and Amazon links there as well.
What's the best way for people who wish to support you? Like, what gets the most money into your pocket?
That would be the small press.
That would
Things
be
in
the
my
small
chest.
press.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Graham. This has been an amazing pleasure. And I'll have to have you back on again to talk more about your poetry and work. And again, please, everyone, go and follow Graham. What's the name of your press again?
Things in my chest.
Things in My Chest. And then you also have a heavy metal project as well, right?
I do. Ghosts of Shadow Moses.
Ghosts of Shadow Moses. So please go check out their small limited press, Things in My Chest, as well as their band Shadow Moses, and their book, which we've just spent the last hour and a half talking about. The things, The Flesh is Not a Prison. So thanks again, Graham, and peace and love, everyone. You have a wonderful evening.